Well, today I'm going to be speaking about power-distorted plantation relationships, leaving them empty. And so we're going to talk about the master-slave relationship. And that's may not be the most exciting title, but I have some really good stories to tell you today, and I have some deep analysis to provide for you today, so that you come away with hopefully a greater appreciation of what went on day to day on the plantations, within the mind of the slave and the slave owner. Now, when we talk about slavery, right away, I suppose some folks feel that maybe it's a little bit awkward. If you're going to talk about slavery in any sort of benign way, then maybe that makes someone nervous. Perhaps we should state 4 or 5 times before the program's over that slavery is wrong. And if anybody has any doubts about that, slavery is wrong. But in the classroom, and I teach at Penn State credit courses in the history department in the evenings, and I have for a little over 2 years now. I'm very proud of that. And I taught for 15 years at Harrisburg Area Community College in the history department, credit courses there. And in the classroom, what I'm about to talk to you about is it doesn't raise any eyebrows. I mean, these are conversations you frequently had. One of my major fields at Lehigh University in my doctoral studies was African American history essentially from 1500 to the present. Does that mean I know it all? No, but it means I had to pass exams on that, and it meant I had to spend a lot of time studying it. So I'll share a little bit with you of what I learned over the years. I had African American professors in the classroom talk about things that maybe other folks would be uncomfortable, but it's a scientific study, and what we're about to talk about is not awkward in the classroom. Okay. Now, power-distorted plantation relationships, leaving them empty. And so towards the end, we'll look at how plantation owners were dismayed when what they considered to be loyal slaves just walked away. We have to find out why they just walked away. So we have to provide context and background. So let's do that here early on. So as we talk about distorted relationships on the plantation, we need to begin with a little bit of context. And so let's go to the timeline to abolition. 1794, the cotton gin is a very, very pivotal invention with slavery and the kind of slavery that leads to the relationships we're going to discuss, and ultimately toward the Civil War. From a technology perspective, if you don't have the cotton gin, you may not have the American Civil War. You could blame the cotton gin as much as anything else. Industrialization had many faces in the early 19th century, and the cotton gin was essential to that. What it did was it allowed for mass production of cotton so that you could plant many times the size crop, and then instead of spending hours and hours of labor-intensive work having individual slaves picking out thorns and prickers and all kinds of messy stuff out of cotton, you could run it through this mill and it would do it automatically. So that meant you could produce a much larger fold, a much larger crop. And that fed the Industrial Revolution in England, among other things, and made a lot of people wealthy in the Old South. So the cotton gin that kick starts the timeline to abolition. In 1808, the slave trade legally ends in the U.S. The Founding Fathers had agreed to that in the Constitution, which was ratified in 1789, that the slave trade would end officially in 1808. Well, W.B. Du Bois wrote in his book Souls of Black Folks in 1901 that he didn't believe it stopped, but we know it stopped legally in 1808. That happened to not be a good combination for people living in the South, for planters, because here's the ending of slaves being imported at the very time that the cotton crop is taking off. So if you're going to produce much larger cotton crops, you need more slaves to mass produce cotton to feed England's Industrial Revolution. So it was somewhat of a contradiction, a misfortune for planters that they could not bring in any more slaves just at the time that the cotton gin made cotton profitable. So how did they work that out? Well, in the 1820s, slaves were sold from the upper to the lower South for cotton production. By the time of the Civil War, there were 50,000 free blacks in Virginia. There were many more, several hundred thousand slaves that had been moved from Virginia to Georgia and parts of the lower South to work the cotton crop. So they shifted the labor from Virginia and North Carolina to lower parts of the South. Tobacco had been very big in Virginia in the 1600s and the 1700s, but cotton became the production crop in the 1800s. So there was this shift, and they moved them in coffles. You can see this is a picture below of movement of slaves in Africa, but it gives you an image of what it would have been to move slaves from the upper to the lower South in the 1820s. And this is all part of the timeline to abolition. The abolition movement reacts to this in 1831 by the ramping up of cotton. Let me give you just a little more context, because context is vital, again, to understand what's going on. Slavery was declining prior to the invention of the cotton gin. And some of the civil rights that would come to African Americans decades later were starting to come to them immediately after the Revolution, but the cotton gin reversed all of that. So it's important that once you have this major cash crop and industrialization of cotton, everything becomes more serious all of a sudden. It's also important, you've heard me say this on other presentations, I tell my students redundancy is sometimes a good thing, and it is. These are staple points to make. Ending of slavery had been going on gradually in the North already. You all know that through what's known as Quaker manumission. Quaker manumission was a 50-year plan to gradually end slavery in the North through people and the states investing, gradually the colonies and then eventually the states, investing, and business people investing in institutions that would teach slaves how to read, write, and various other ways to integrate into Western society. Houses of refuge, orphanages, mechanical schools, classical schools were created by the Quakers to gradually manumit slaves over a 50-year period and blend them in gradually into white Western society. Pennsylvania, for all intents and purposes, was ending slavery by the 1780s. There are a couple of old plantations around here too that had slaves. Archaeologically, we've proven that. There was slavery in York, Pennsylvania, just 30 miles east of here in the 1700s. So, and New York City ended slavery in 1826. Delaware and New Jersey still had it on the books as late as the Civil War, but it was phasing out through Quaker manumission. It was a gradual thing. There was also another remedy for ending slavery or reducing its impact, and that was called, it was Henry Clay pushed forward this idea, and there were some other important people behind it, and it was to buy up land in Africa, Liberia, and also in places in South America and shift slaves there. The idea was reduce the slave population drastically through not shipping everyone to back to Africa or to South America, but enough to where the levels came down equal to whites, because South Carolinians in particular were frightened that if slavery suddenly ended, they were outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1, and there would be retribution, and rightfully so. And so Henry Clay and others purported these ideas. Abraham Lincoln, as late as 1865, sent Dan Sickles down to South America to look at a way of sending thousands of African Americans after Emancipation Proclamation to South America to reduce those levels so there could be some kind of medium or balance between the races and numbers. So that idea was around as well. Abolition never really had any traction until 1831 in light of the circumstances I've given you now. Abolition, you and I see it as the right course, absolutely the right course. Only someone is highly prejudiced and an idiot would argue otherwise. But at the time, in 1831, abolition was considered radical. Why was it considered radical? By comparison to Quaker manumission, which was a gradual system of ending slavery over 50 years, and in light of shifting slaves to Liberia. So radical was, it called for instant ending to slavery, sort of like jump off a cliff, build a parachute on the way down. There was no plan for how to integrate former slaves into society afterwards. And so abolition made a lot of people nervous. It made people nervous, and Southerners, planters, played into those fears. You remember when Jefferson Davis gave his resignation speech to Congress as he stepped down from being Secretary of War. He talked about the card that most Northerners feared. He said, you know, if you free all 4 million slaves, they're going to move north. They're going to overtake your jobs in the cities. You're going to have to compete for positions that don't pay enough as it is. And, you know, let's just leave it there. But abolition was considered, it was considered an all or nothing proposition. You and I applaud it today. But nevertheless, abolition was in response to what was going on with cotton and with the shifting of slaves to concentrate them in the South. The 1830s, slave owners realized they needed some kind of PR campaign to offset what was going on. You know how when big tobacco was attacked in the 1990s, and there were all these commercials related to cancer and heart troubles and any number of other troubles related to tobacco. Tobacco, Winston-Salem and other big tobacco companies, countered with their own versions of what cigarettes did, you know, and then they promoted NASCAR more vigorously and so forth. They had this counter campaign to say, look, this is what all the good that tobacco's done for people over the years. Well, pro-slavery had to come back with something to stop the momentum of abolition. And so this started pro-slavery propaganda. You can look this up online. You can find good books on pro-slavery. What is pro-slavery? Pro-slavery were people that came out in an atmosphere where abolition was really gaining traction, and where slave owners were looking increasingly, think of big tobacco in the 90s, they were looking more and more evil. And so through pamphlets that were being published, through lectures that were being given, through newspapers, inserts that would advertise in major northern newspapers, Southern planters started to advertise their perspective, and they tried to put a kinder, friendlier face on slavery to counteract the language on the other side. They conducted a public relations campaign in response to abolition. These pro-slavers propagandized that the institution of slavery replaced tribal savageries and superstitions with Western culture and Christianity. The idea is that slaves, they were telling the American public who were starting to listen to the abolitionists, they were saying, wait a minute, slaves are better off here with being introduced through the plantation to Western civilization, Western culture, to Western Christianity, and that will be better for them in the long run than the superstitions and the tribal savageries that they find in Africa. Now let's hone in on this word savagery. Some of you have been with me on enough talks to know that I enjoy etymology, and etymology is the study of words and the meaning of words. In this case, savagery is a loaded historical term. You have to understand that before Darwinism, remember, national directives in public education don't start until the 1890s. Public schools were not considering teaching evolution until the 1920s, the Scopes trials. Okay, so the idea of evolution, uniformitarianism, that was not being taught to people in the 1850s or the 1860s. There was nothing to compete with God. And so this brings up the old question of when does racism begin? When are the races ordered biologically? And there's a little bit of that going on in the early 1800s. But it's not until Darwinism gains traction in the classroom in the 1920s, long after the Civil War, that people are thinking of African Americans as biologically inferior to some other race. And of course, this is tragic to say, but we're just talking about it clinically. So how were, if the Origin of Species was only written in the 1850s and didn't gain traction until almost 70 years later, how did whites perceive blacks if they didn't see them as lower on the pecking order than white Aryans? How did they perceive them? They perceived them as savage, not biologically inferior, but savage. Savage would mean, think about if you were going to move to a certain neighborhood, and let's say it's in an urban area where the crime rate is really bad, and it's been bad for a long time. And it's complicated, and there's a lot of blame to go around, and politicians are at fault, and there's a lot of people that are at fault. But nevertheless, bottom line is, you don't want to buy a home in an area that has high crime reported on a daily basis there. Well, in a similar way, pilgrims in the 1600s, colonists in the 1700s, U.S. citizens in the 1800s, they looked around at white civilization, Western culture, as the most civilized. And they saw tribes as savage. If you study anthropology, the study of cultures, what do you have at your basics? You have a band, then you have a tribe, then you have a chiefdom, and then you have statehood. Statehood is considered the highest level of civilization. Well, a lot of the African slaves that were brought over were considered part of tribes, small bands and tribes. That would be lower in terms of civilization from a Caucasian perspective. So Native Americans and African Americans in particular were considered savage from the perspective that their civilizations were not at the level that whites perceived that they would be. And so savage is a key word here. If you go back in the literature, watch this now. This is for your future knowledge. When you're reading references by whites to blacks in the 1850s and the 1860s, you're not going to see anything about Darwin. You're not going to see anything about ordering of the species. You're not going to hear anything along those lines. What you'll read is the word over and over and over again, savage. Savage. And so you don't, the savage element then needed to be brought under the hegemony, if you will, of the Western culture. Okay, pro-slavery propagandists also distributed rhetoric proposing the institution brought orderly production and training in various trades. And so through Northern newspaper inserts that were paid for by owners, through bulletins, through articles that were written, through small pamphlet books that were published, there was this propaganda, if you will. It was to counter Uncle Tom's Cabin and these other literatures that were coming out by the Abolition. It was to counter them with this counteractive campaign that said, no, look, there's orderly production. Slaves are being brought not only into Western culture, but they're being taught trades. They can blacksmith, they can do carpentry, they can work mills, they can do all of these different things, and they are learning these various things along the way. If you study the Chesapeake, in the late 1700s, all throughout the early 1800s, most of the trades, the skilled artisan trades that I mentioned, are represented among slaves that were working along the Chesapeake. Does that make slavery right? No, it doesn't make it right. But were there trades learned on the plantation? Absolutely. Thomas Jefferson at Monticello had African Americans were working all kinds of positions. Slavery's absolutely wrong, but nevertheless, there are these different trades. Pro-slavery tried to put a kind, gentle face on it to the North. Say, do you really want to pursue the path of abolition? And so they played into their fears, particularly where work was concerned. Now, the reason I didn't pick this particular remote earlier was for the reason that you're seeing. It's flitty. It jumps all over the place. Okay, pro-slavery propaganda. Owners dishonestly emphasized that slaves were well-clothed, housed, fed, and happy in their condition. They emphasized that in their propaganda campaign. They also emphasized, pro-slavery advocates grossly manipulated the 1840 census, the first census in this country's history. Its findings to state freedom caused insanity to northern African Americans. And so, this idea that there's an asterisk at the end of the census, and there's this data about those that have already been manumitted in the North have trouble, many times more trouble with alcohol and many more trouble with vagrancy and this, that, and the other. And of course, all of that those findings were manipulated, and the pro-slavers reminded people who were hearing about abolition more and more in the North, they reminded them through publications, hey, did you read the latest census? African Americans they can't actually handle freedom. Are these cruel things? Are they uncomfortable things? Absolutely. Okay. It's once the other one failed me, I just have to deal with this. Hopefully you'll deal with it too. Okay. Pro-slavery propaganda. Many owners allowed churches to missionize slaves in the 1830s. This was another response to abolition, was to allow missionaries from various denominations, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterian, and other denominations prevalent in the South, to come onto the plantations and to preach, quote unquote, the gospel, the good news, to tell them about Christian religion. And slaves were portrayed as children under the master's care, even as the masters fell under divine master's care. The Bible was used by pro-slavery to promote slavery. They plucked out passages from the 13 epistles that Paul wrote in the New Testament that talk about masters being loyal to their slaves. And of course, slaves hated that part of the lectures. When they would sit in a church and listen, a lot of times they were in balconies or they were along the aisles on the sides of the church. They were made to stand. They were never given the better seats. And they frequently, well, let's put it this way, they grew used to the pastor looking out and making eye contact with them when they read such verses. So pro-slavery tried to, again, put on a kinder, gentler face that slavery was a benevolent institution, that it was beneficial, and that it cared for the souls of the slaves. So the delusion of pro-slavery was slave owners convinced themselves that African Americans benefited from the culture, religion, and structure provided on the plantation. Owners persuaded themselves that slaves could not cope with freedom and were better off as children under their care. Notice I used the word delusion. And they continued to live under that delusion. Philip, is there a way, could you take a look at the other remote and see if you can find a way to make it work? I'm using the backup. Thank you. Okay, the reality, though, was much different. The reality was that under this whole notion that there was order and structure on the plantation, that there was a caring for the souls of African Americans, that they were well-fed, well-clothed, well-housed. Behind all of this was the reality that they were slaves. And the symbol of that reality was the auction block. The fly in the ointment was power. Power is defined as when those on the receiving, losing end of power have no rights to redress grievances. Let me say that again. Power is defined as when those on the receiving or losing end of power have no rights to redress grievances. And so what do we mean by this? My 13-year-old son now in 8th grade is studying the American Revolution. And they're not talking about this in the class, but I insisted that he hear this part because this is crucial background information. And it is one of the most important outcomes of the American Revolution was at least the profession in the Declaration of Independence and certain freedoms listed in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution, that power would be replaced with authority. Essentially, power would be replaced with authority. See, before the American Revolution, power was the order. There was an old order, an aristocracy, if you will, landed wealth, land grants, people who lived here known as Tories before the Revolution. And there were names that went way back, and they were steeped in wealth, steeped in culture, steeped in education. And they were considered the better orders. Well, the Revolution on pen and paper did away with that. Were you able to fix it? Can everyone give Philip a round of applause? Thank you. He'll be speaking to you later. He has his own lecture coming up. So power is different than authority. Power is people have to listen to you. They have to fear you. You might even have control of their life. You have to listen to them. Why? Because they're your social betters. They're born into a position that you could only dream to step into, that you have very little geographic mobility, social mobility to be able to climb that ladder to achieve the level that they're at, that they're born with. It's an inherited status that they have. Authority is different. Authority is earned through persuasion, right? So let's say you own Starbucks and you want to run your company at the highest possible levels. As long as you persuade, you stay in business. If you don't persuade, whether through your marketing or through the product, on how good it is and so forth, as long as you don't persuade, as long as you persuade, you grow, you have profit. If you fail to persuade, you go into liquidation, you go into bankruptcy, you go into Chapter 7 or 11, right? The same is true in the military. As long as you persuade, you're promoted. It's true in business as well, and it's true in politics as well. As long as you persuade, if you were elected for 2 years, 4, 6 years, if you persuade, you'll be re-elected when your term is up. If you fail to persuade, it's out with the bum, right? And there's a constant attempt to erode at power or at authority. If you've ever been in charge of anything, you know, get ready. You're going to be constantly experience friction as long as you have authority over people. If you fail to persuade, eventually you're gone. That's not true with power. Power can be permanent. There's a couple instances where I experienced that. One of them is when the King of Jordan visited the park here. I was given the honor of taking him on a tour through the visitor center here and through the museum. And we came to a choke point in the museum, and it dawned on me for the first time that he owned a country and I owned a car and a house. And for a moment it was overwhelming. You know, I'd ask his entourage the day before he arrived, because they came here to scout it out. He was here to visit with President Obama. He wanted to see the battlefield. So the entourage came here a day early, and I asked them, so what do I call him? They said, you call him Your Majesty. And Americans don't do that. The Revolution at least theoretically ended that, and then we've had wars to try to make it all come true. So power is, in his entourage, by the way, though there is a constitutional system there in Jordan, you realize that they could disappear and he wouldn't lose his position. And they knew it. That's real power. Okay? And so the revolution, we asked the big question, how revolutionary was the revolution? Whole entire courses are built around that question, 4-month courses at major universities. How revolutionary was the revolution? Well, because women didn't receive the right to vote, Native Americans until 1920, we had to fight a civil war to end slavery. Not very revolutionary, right? But at least the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights stated that power would give way eventually to rule of law. And so slaves did not have an avenue to redress grievances. They were subjects to power. And at the essence of that, the symbolic truth of slavery is the slave auction block. And symbolic truth is a concept that has power over life and death itself. How many of you have heard me talk about symbolic truth before? The copse of trees are symbolic truth. You all know there's been an argument for years over whether Pickett's charge aimed towards the copse of trees or not. And, I published a book in the early 2000s and wrote a chapter arguing that the copse of trees were not the point of direction for Pickett's charge. But in any case, whatever side you stand on, whether that they were aiming for the copse of trees or whether they were aiming for Ziegler's Grove, what the soldiers were aiming for can always be debated. But where the copse of trees is significant is not that some or many soldiers aim for them. It's that they are the symbolic truth that this is where the war turned. Think of a moment in your life where there was a moment, an event, maybe hopefully a good thing, a birth, a marriage, some really positive thing that occurred in your life, a graduation. And from that moment on, things were never the same. It was a monumental date and marker in your mind. Are you following me? And that's what the copse of trees represents. It's a moment where the South lost something, started to lose traction, and never got it back again. That's what the copse of trees and high watermark represent. Another example of symbolic truth, let me give this one quick, it fits in really nicely. Frederick Douglass wrote in his memoirs and he wrote his memoirs, published his memoirs, something like 30, 40 years after the Civil War, because he didn't want to give away secrets that would hurt other runaway slaves. He didn't want to give away their secrets. He lived around Baltimore, lived in Baltimore proper. And he watched the train come into the depot each day, the B&O. He would watch it come in and go out, watch it come in and go out. And he watched it leave to go north towards Philadelphia. And he knew that once you crossed the Pennsylvania border, that was freedom. So to him, the train was not just a train, it was more than technology, steam engine. It was more than rail. It was more than the staff that was employed to work on the train. No, to him, the train's symbolic truth was the train represented what? Freedom. And so he sat there for years trying to figure out a way how to get on that train, because he knew if he could just somehow disguise himself and get on the train, it took him to freedom. And he finally figured out a way. There were sailors that came into port in Baltimore. And occasionally some from New England, and there were African Americans who were free and they had papers and they could walk into Baltimore with their papers and remain free. And so he dressed up as a sailor one day, bought his ticket at the last minute, got on the train at the last minute, hoping not to give away what he was about to do. The train stopped twice on the way to Philly, both times for unexplained reasons, but both times he made eye contact through the window with people who knew him from slavery times. The second person, he said, owned him. He said he knew the person saw him. He waited while the laborers worked on the train, and he said he was sweating from head to toe. But he said after the eye contact, the owner did nothing. The train continued north, and he made it to Philadelphia, made it to freedom. That's symbolic truth. The train represents freedom, right? And the symbolic truth of this is why slavery is not a benevolent institution. You can never get away from the slave block. The slave block. And it just show it, and it has power over life. Now, I don't want to make you too uncomfortable, but but I really want it to sink in. Let's think of something in your life that if it were to change, you were to lose all of your freedom, and it were to be gone just like that. Or imagine living under someone who could take your freedom away anytime they wanted to. Ooh, that's scary, isn't it? All right, now that's what we're talking about here. Power and degrees of unfreedom. Power and degrees of unfreedom. Chattel slavery is on one end of the spectrum of degrees of unfreedom. Think of a spectrum of colors, or just think of a spectrum of colors, and think of chattel slavery as on one end of the spectrum, and think of absolute freedom as on the other end of the spectrum. But chattel slavery is one extreme, and then absolute freedom is the other extreme. But there are degrees of unfreedom, aren't there? And we've seen that, of course, across our history. 7-year apprenticeships were quite common in colonial times and in the early Republic. Indentured servitude. Women and Native Americans denied the vote until 1920. There have been debates about freedom over and over, all the way up to our time, about how can we expand freedom. So there are powers and degrees of unfreedom. Chattel slavery is one extreme, and the auction block is the symbolic truth of that. There's 2 recent new books that have come out that expand on this. William Green's Degrees of Freedom and Rebecca Scott's Degrees of Freedom. One looks on the origin of civil rights in Minnesota, 1865 to 1912, and the other compares and contrasts. We're always doing history at a higher level when we compare and contrast. In this case, Louisiana and Cuba under slavery. There are degrees of freedom and unfreedom. Think of economically, there are degrees of freedom and unfreedom. Right? And a lot of these unfreedoms have been removed over the years. Did you know that people used to go to debtor's prison for a certain amount of debt? There were also public hangings, people publicly executed. Those kinds of things represent the state having absolute power over an individual's life, and the state wanting to publicly demonstrate that. People don't allow that anymore. Executions are done behind the scenes. Why? Power has gradually diminished. That was the goal of the Declaration of Independence, replace power with authority. And our nation's history has largely been about removing all elements of power so that we all fall under rule of law, and birth means nothing, talent means everything. Hard work and talent mean everything. Okay, and so the auction block, as the symbolic truth of the auction block demonstrated, that slavery dehumanizes. Now, what about family? Pro-slavery tried to put this kinder, gentler face to Northerners to counteract the abolitionist movement and say, well, look, they're families, and we promote marriages on the plantations. And there's a mother and father and daughter and son and grandparents and all these good things. And they have their own house and they have their own garden and they work trades. But that there's a family, there's a nuclear family. Well, the problem with that, again, is power. Power under might. Remember, the auction block is the symbolic truth of power. And so power undermines the family. The father was powerless within the family due to the planter's prerogative to bypass him on matters related to his wife and children. Imagine, I have a 13-year-old son. Imagine if with your children, you went to discipline them through timeout or through, they have to stay off their electronics for a while, which is what we do with our son. And you have your ways of getting the message across. Denying them something maybe that they want until they start to act better. Imagine if you no longer had the moral right to be able to look your child in the face and be able to direct their future, or that someone else could step in at any moment and take that away from you. Can you see that? And so a father would watch their children, in some cases, be taken out and whipped, and a lesson being made of, and the father, how do you think the father or the mother felt watching that, and they were not able to do it? What message does that send to the child? It sends a message that you're just a puppet figure at best. You're weak. All respect is called into question. Now, when we do history at a higher levels, if we try to, and I tell my Penn State students this constantly in writing and occasionally orally, and it is, we have to be making contextual points. We have to ask the so what questions and the why questions. Why is this important to us today? Because history is important as it helps us understand the present, right? And we have to go deeply to do that. So what is it that's so important about this today? African American intellectuals will tell you now that one of the bigger problems in African American communities across the whole country is the absent father. Okay, they'll tell you that. You can find it online. It's not something that, and again in the classroom, it's talked about by African American professors with ease. And it doesn't mean that unilaterally that's the case, but that's why there was the Million Man March on the Mall and calling for stronger fathers across religions and across faiths. It's because why is there this absentee problem of black males in black families staying in the home? And the answer goes back to slavery. They were robbed initially of their basic dignity in the family. Their place in the home was taught wrongly from the beginning. Can you see that? And so the legacy is still with us. Does that always apply? No, there are always exceptions, but that's a concern. Let me add this too real quickly. Why is it that all of the other, my wife took a course at Temple University many years ago, an African American course, and the final exam question, she was the only Caucasian in the room. They were all African Americans in the room. The professor was African American. Wonderful class. But the question was, and the professor really wanted everyone to get at the answer, why among all the ethnic groups that have come over to this country, even as recently as Vietnamese, if you go back to, Irish, to German, Romanian, Italian, Poles, any group that you want to name that's come over, every one of them have made their way up the social ladder to some extent and have been able to climb. The only group, the ethnic group that's come over to this country that is still struggling to climb are African Americans. Now, one answer that she was looking for, the professor was looking for, was they're the only group brought over against their will. Okay, but here's the extension to that answer. All those other groups came over in what's called chain migration. Chain migration, for instance, in an Italian neighborhood in Lower East Side, New York, for instance, or a Jewish neighborhood in the same area. When they would come over, a father and his son would come over. They would work for a few weeks, raise enough money to send it back overseas for the next family member to come over, and then the next, and they would create separate Jewish neighborhoods or separate Italian neighborhoods or separate Irish or German neighborhoods. That's chain migration. You bring them over one at a time after a time. They created separate little Italies, separate little Germanys, separate little Polands, and in those places they spoke the same language. They helped each other out. They gave loans in the grocery stores. They had their own banks, their own orphanages, their own libraries, their own institutions to further each other. African Americans didn't have any of that. They were brought over from various tribes so that they couldn't speak the same language. They were intentionally segmented, broken up, and then they were suddenly thrust into freedom without any institution to help each other. That's why the church became so important. That's why every generation of African Americans have had some great spiritual leader, whether it's Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or Jesse Jackson or any number of other folks, is that the church filled that void to a large extent. But those basic institutions, including the family, were on shaky ground from the very beginning. I promise to move quicker, but do you like these points? This is called analysis, right? If I were just to give out basic facts, that's called chronology. Chronology is the lowest level of history you can practice. You have to have analysis for the facts to make sense. All right, how did African Americans then resist power? If you're in a situation where someone has total, God forbid, total power over you, you have to find ways to resist, okay? And these are the ways that they resist. You know, there are slaves in cities now. You all know about this. That women are told if you say anything, you're already illegal here. They're going to send you back. You know, we know all the people you're talking to. You're going to be punished. And out of fear, they stay in a compromised setting. Resistance, absconding is one form of resistance. African Americans would leave for a while, not permanently, but leave the plantation for a while. One favorite place for South Carolinians to go would be, you all know there are a lot of rivers along Charleston. And they found lagoons and islands. We know African Americans would run across the Florida border when it was Spanish territory up till 1820 and after, and intermingle with Seminoles, and they would be hiding there for a while. They would hide in cities. Cities were places where they could easily hide and just sort of disappear. Hiding on another plantation. Slaves had incredible kinship networks. You know, when the Haitian Revolution occurred in 1791, where overtures, Haitians defeated Napoleon's troops, essentially Napoleonic French troops, and declared the first black republic in the New World. That was in 1791. That knowledge spread all through the lower American South instantly, not through cell phone, but through word of mouth. They knew each other across plantation lines. And of course, it scared a lot of white Southerners to death at that information. The term colored, an early term for African Americans, came from the Haitians who won in 1791, being seen as heroes by slaves in the American South. They called their soldiers people of color. So that's where that term eventually came from. Another form of resistance was the Underground Railroad. Now, Gettysburg was an Underground Railroad stop. You all know about that for a couple of reasons. One, Pennsylvania is a free state. Maryland is a slave state. And so if you want to cross from anywhere in the lower South, the upper South, into freedom, you had to come into Pennsylvania, at least along the eastern coast. And slaves always, through their quilting, decoded quilting designs that told them where to go and their secret maps and so forth, they were always told to follow rivers and mountains. Rivers, because if you crossed the river periodically back and forth, you would lose what? The scent of dogs. There's a professor at Temple University, an African-American professor there, who I don't think she's been here in several years, but she used to bring her African-American students from Temple. And at night, they would walk from Maryland along the Monocacy and its branches known as Pipe Creek and then Rock Creek and Marsh Creek. They would follow those branches, crisscross them, only just a small sample segment, back and forth with lanterns at night. And she would hold up a boom box with dogs barking. And then they stopped at McAllister Mill, the remnants of McAllister Mill, which is next to McDuffer's Miniature Golf. You all know where that is, about 2 miles south of here on the Baltimore Pike. That was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. And so she would demonstrate to them those kinds of emotions to connect. We're taught in our Ranger schools to connect with the listener emotionally and intellectually, and that's what I'm trying to do with you here. So Underground Railroad, they would follow the Monocacy around here to freedom. They also followed the South Mountain. I published an article a few years ago, and I'm not bragging, I just tell you these things. I've worked for 32 years in the Park Service. I've gotten to a point now where I don't get any charge out of telling you these. You know, I published this or that. When you retire, most people don't care anyway. You know, and it's an old article now, but about 7 or 8 years ago, I wrote an article that was published Wayne Mott's published it in the Adams County Historical Journal, and it goes out to several thousand people, and they have subscribers. And it was one of 4 articles picked, but it's on slave labor working at Pine Grove Furnace and at Caledonia Furnace. They learned that Thaddeus Stevens and an operator at Pine Grove Furnace would hire them if they escaped across the Maryland border, and they could work charcoaling and stay in the woods, stay shrouded in the secrecy of the woods. They didn't have any collective bargaining power, obviously. They weren't citizens, but they were given a fair sum. And so the South Mountain also pointed north, just like the North Star, and that made Gettysburg. That would be another way to resist power. Another way would be work gangs. And in work gangs, they worked in groups of 4 to control the pace. Working in gangs allowed them to control the pace. I remember when I first started here many years ago, someone told me, and their name will remain anonymous, they told me, don't work too fast, don't be writing too many things, or don't say, because then all of us will be required to do that too. And I remember, you all remember Eric Campbell? Oh, sure. Yeah, okay. And Eric he always had papers in his hands, and he was always working, and so, and then it all sort of, we all caught the fever. I think I already had that fever in me, but always writing something or trying to write something, always trying to present something, always think something. When they worked in gangs, they actually could control the pace. If they slowed down the pace, then they slowed down production. It was a way to negotiate quietly in a realm where they had no power. And by the way, it works, And it works with authority as well as it works with power. Resistance also involves stealing. They would resist power by stealing. The moral line of stealing was crossed with slavery. So the occasional stealing of vegetables or poultry from the master to feed the family should not surprise. That moral line was crossed. You stole my body. If I want some vegetables or poultry every once in a while, what are you going to say about it? And so those lines were crossed. Stealing away meant stealing your own body away. Just in case somebody's listening on YouTube or whatever, I want to be very, very clear about this. It sounds like a moral statement, but when I say I want to be very clear. Suicide's never the answer. Never go there. But slaves in some desperate conditions went there. When slaves were being brought out of Africa on the African slave trade in the 1500s, 1600s, when they would be brought up from the lower deck where there was vomit and urine and defecation, they'd be brought up for fresh air every so often so that the sailors could clear out the lower deck. When they would bring them up, sometimes slaves would just jump overboard at that point. It was a way of stealing away. That's the academic term. Okay, you may take my body, but ultimately I'll take it back. The African Burial Ground National Monument in Manhattan, New York is a fascinating place. If any of you visited it, it's in Lower Manhattan. In 1991, some high-rise buildings were being demolished, and someone said, hey, wait a minute, there's something here at the foundation. They did a little bit of research at the historical societies and found out there was a burial ground there, and there are 15,000, this is a National Park Service plaque, there are 15,000 burials in Lower Manhattan. And we know that they were all slaves. We know that they were all slaves. Why do we know that? Because in close investigation into many of the caskets, they found cowrie shells. And what are cowrie shells? Cowrie shells, right. Cowrie shells are used for divination. That is, if they are placed in someone's casket, an African American slave's casket, this is what they mean. It's a vow of escape after death in the spiritual realm. They believed that the cowrie shells gave them supernatural powers to fly back across the ocean back to Africa. So they could fly away was the precise term. You hear that term occasionally in the literature. They would fly away. The cowrie shells are, and if you're a person given to emotion, this is a powerful statement. It's saying, I might die here a slave, but you can't take my spirit. That's a powerful vow, isn't it? Okay. And so that's another form of resistance. They might quietly play the part all during their lifetime, but this message is very strong and it's for eternity. Another form of resistance against power was, and it doesn't make it right, but is burning a profitable crop like cotton, because it attacks the financial system that makes profit at your expense. People will wonder sometimes why, when there's riots, and we've seen some in the last 2 years, haven't we? And you can fill in the blanks. That's for someone else to discuss. But you wonder, why would they burn down a convenience store? Or why would they burn, that just hurts them. Or why would they burn down this institution or that institution? This does not make it right. I'm not making it any kind of moral statement for this. I'm just giving an explanation. The explanation is to those that feel oppressed, the financial system represents something that gained prominence at their expense. Okay, and it's a way of attacking the thing that enslaves them, in this case, economically. The birth cycle is another form of resistance, interrupting and delaying the birth cycle through nursing longer. Women have learned over the ages that if you nurse longer for a year or 2 years, the longer you nurse, that directly affects the ability to be pregnant. So they would slow down the birth rate. That slowed down the property value. A slave could cost up to $1,500 to $2,000. And so if you, this is sad, it's tragic. We're talking about it from an academic standpoint, but when slaves were examined on the auction block, sometimes women were stripped down and they were examined for childbearing for this reason. And one way to resist quietly was nurse longer. You like this? It's a way of fighting back. Okay. And then another way of resisting was cultural survivals. Cultural survivals are music, art, pottery, jumping the broom, any number of other things that were brought over. It's a way of saying that what was brought over from Africa might be extra legal, if not illegal here, but we're going to find a way underground, in the woods, under a campfire at night, we're going to find a way to express ourselves from our homeland. And then the last form of resistance that you're most, by the way, you all can use any of these. If you're in an oppressive place in terms of authority, I've just given you all kinds of tools to counteract with. Now, I don't want to hear arson later on, and and don't harm yourself for God's sake. But there are subtle ways without having to have full-fledged revolt. And Troy said it's okay to slow down the work pace, but now revolt then would be the most overt example of resisting against power. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, Gabriel Prosser's rebellion of sorts in Virginia around Richmond in 1800, Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in 1822, and then of course the big one, the 180,000 African Americans that joined the Union Army between 1863 and 65 and served in the North, and we have 2 of those African Americans buried in the National Cemetery. If you go to the black cemetery in town, have any of you done that? The Lincoln Cemetery. I do a tour there. I didn't do it last summer, but I'm one of the rangers. Chuck Teague, I think, does a tour over there too, but there's a few of us that do a tour through the black cemetery, and there are 35 African American soldiers that fought for the North that are buried there. Isn't that neat? Okay, and that's right here in Gettysburg, right beside the hospital. Okay. But resistance then, okay. Now, I'm probably running out of time here. I'm going to blame it on technical difficulties. Okay, and I'll speed it up here, but we've got some really good stuff coming up. All right, liberation comes then when federal armies start to march through cities like Richmond, and African Americans can't believe this day has finally come. Many of them have prayed for it. They dare not speak it. They whispered it at the threat of losing their life. But it finally comes in April of 1865 and in the months that follow. Federal soldiers start to come onto southern plantations and read the Emancipation Proclamation. And it becomes very real at that point that they're free. This power that they resisted in all kinds of ways for many years is finally removed. And then the Emancipation Proclamation is read in all kinds of formal settings. And obviously a lot of the slaves are not literate, but there will be people that are literate and they read it to the others. What does this mean, the Emancipation Proclamation? In the Southwest, Adjutant General Thomas addresses African Americans on the duties of freedom. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, along with other salutatory addresses, are given to African Americans as they're gradually liberated from April through June of 1865. Now, some African Americans stay where they are. They just live under, you studied this in school years ago, sharecropping and peonage systems, and it's not a whole lot better. There is economic slavery, the degrees of unfreedom that come with that, and then eventually Jim Crow laws. But some of them stay because of the familiarity with place. I'm going to quote Leon Litwack several more times before we're done in his Been in the Storm So Long. He states, numerous ex-slaves felt not so much to the old master or mistress, but to the region they knew most intimately. So there's not this loyalty to the mistress or the master, but there's a familiarity with the region. And so the familiar surroundings in which they had been raised caused some of them to stay. That's called familiarity with place. This is the book that I'm quoting. I'll quote it 2 or 3 more times. When you see a page number at the bottom of the slide, I'm quoting Leon Litwack's Been in the Storm So Long. It's a highly acclaimed book. I highly recommend it. And it looks in great depth. There's hundreds of pages. It looks at great depth of how slaves reacted when they were being freed on these plantations, and their elation and their jubilation and their disbelief and how they reacted. Litwack also tells us this, that is, the familiarity with place will be of great service to us in reorganizing this country under the new order of things. That's a Freedman's Bureau official said that. So they take advantage of that there's a familiarity with place, and some African Americans, former slaves, want to give it a go where they lived or near where they lived. But then many more leave. And although they're not precise numbers, the indication is that most of them leave and at least try another plantation. But leaving, if Litwack says, if servants felt insulted or compromised, or if the employer resorted to the whip, they often chose to leave. That could be one motivation. They were leaving as early as 1862, then after the Emancipation, 1863, and then in April through June of 1865, they were leaving in even larger numbers. There was an urban attraction. A lot of the slaves went to the city. Why? Because there were numbers in their favor. I went to see my first ever Star Wars the other day with my son. I missed I heard there were 6 others and I never saw them, you know. And, I know, but when I was there, I couldn't believe, I didn't know the terminology, I didn't know the people. I didn't know the other episodes, but I could hear people talking in the line while they're buying their popcorn and Coke. And when they all got in this flooded room, it was clear that they were all of like mind. Numbers mattered. They were all, they all. And so who doesn't like numbers? I tell people this on the anniversary every July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. When I have a tour and I'm fortunate enough to have couple hundred people, I'll say, this is the one time of the year where we're in the majority, We're all here, and we're not considered odd were actually all of the same mind. So a lot of African Americans went to the city and numbers were in their favor. There was social mobility and geographic mobility. These are academic terms. Social mobility is the ability to climb the hierarchical chain and to promote your status in life. Geographic mobility is the ability to move around, like the train that Frederick Douglass saw. That's geographic mobility. Your automobile represents geographic mobility. 100 years ago, people could have only dreamed of had that kind of social mobility that you have with your automobile. Cities tend to be more diverse, more transient, more lenient with cultural differences. You know that I lived in Philadelphia in the late 80s. When you worked at the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, cities tend to be more transient, don't they? They tend to be less judgmental too. They tend to be a little bit more fluent, fewer eyes looking at you. And so African Americans went to the cities. And then they also went there for the Freedmen's Bureau. Let's make a bigger point. One of the reasons why there are large African American populations in cities is this reason. They went there initially after the war because they heard the Freedmen's Bureau was there. Now that's not the only reason, but and that's not always the case. But African Americans have moved to cities later in another century. That'll be in our conclusion. But the initial migration to cities starts by, for gosh sakes, let's get off the plantation and let's see what's going on in the city. Urban employment. Going to the cities, you could get jobs on the docks as builders, stevedores, laborers, longshoremen, cargo loaders. So there was that social mobility. And then there was the Freedmen's Bureau there to provide refuge. Remember we talked about jumping off a cliff and building a parachute on the way down? The abolitionist movement didn't like a good pool player think 3 or 4 shots ahead. There wasn't any plan after abolition to integrate black with white society. And so the Freedmen's Bureau became a stopgap measure. They were placed in cities throughout the South as a place of refuge, and slaves learned through word of mouth if they fled there, they would receive protection and benefits. The Freedmen's Bureau performed weddings to make them not only official citizens, but officially married citizens. If you had your wife or husband sold away into slavery, they obviously didn't have computers, but they had ways of finding your relative, at least they would try, so that you could be reunited with a spouse that had been sold years ago. They were a clearinghouse for trying to straighten out what slavery had broken, what power had broken. Freedmen's Bureau also had schools. New England school teachers committed to reading, writing, arithmetic, and freedom life skills. They would teach students these basic skills to help African Americans of another generation blend in with Western culture. Freedmen's Bureau was dedicated to education. Now, on the plantation, there were archetypes. These are terms that are originally prejudicial master terminology. That is, these are terms that white slave owners would use. These are not terms that African Americans would use. African Americans had their own terms for slave owners too. And maybe in a future presentation I can talk about the reverse of all of this. But this would be the terminology, and academics delve into this terminology and debate it and write about it. Both black and white debate, argue, write on these terms quite frequently. And the list is much longer. I didn't put all of the names down, but you've heard other names like Uncle Tom, various other terms that are out there, but these were terms that were used. The terms I have here were largely used by plantation owners. And the big term, the one that was often used and associated for plantation owners with a loyal slave, was Sambo. Sambo was discussed in depth by Stanley Elkins in his pivotal work that came out in 1959 called Slavery. It's a standard read in any African studies class that you take. And he discusses, most of his book revolves around explaining the Sambo personality. Elkins uses psychohistory to explain this archetype. Now, archetype would be a personality that whites would say, okay, and so they would typecast them or stereotype them as fitting into that type of personality. Sambo is the personality who shuffles his feet when power is around. He looks down. He rarely makes eye contact. He says, yes, massa. He smiles all the time. He rarely makes eye contact. But he's amicable, nice, always grins at the right time. He's kind of soft-spoken and never causes a stir. And that's Sambo. Well, Elkins tries to explain Sambo, how Sambo comes to be Sambo. He says that when we do psychohistory on folks that have passed away, we have to be careful because, they're not here to cross-examine. So here's his theory. His theory is that every person from age 1 to about age 15 forms a template in their brain. All of us. Okay, and psychologists talk about this, not just related to slaves, but just as a general concept. The template is our expectations of where the lines are, what lines we don't cross, what lines are socially acceptable, what lines are not socially acceptable, what's considered respectable in society, what's not, what's approved, what's disapproved. We all watch those lines, right? Because we all want to live, most people want to try to live a good life. Stanley Elkins said, and argued in 1959, that the brutality of slavery, he didn't use the term post-traumatic stress disorder, but I think we would use that term today. He said that the slave trade was so horrific and the auction block so dehumanizing and slavery, plantation and slavery, so alienating that Sambo is a picture. That personality is a picture of someone whose template was rearranged during this traumatic period. What Elkins said is that template will remain the same all through your life of where the expectations are, the lines are, expectations for yourself, what's good, bad, what's right, wrong, what others will do, what others won't do. That template will remain in place through your whole life unless a traumatic event occurs. And if it does, it'll rearrange the template and create an alternate reality that you live under during the crisis. And so that alternate reality was Sambo, according to Elkins. He said when all these traumatic things occurred, the slave trade, the slave block, being separated from his family, being separated from everything he knows, the brutality of slavery. When all those things happen, his template for where the lines were and what he had been raised on were radically altered. And so what that caused him to do then was to live in kind of a neutral state where his own identity was compromised. To survive, they accepted that which was abhorrent and it became normal. Can you see that? Now, you think about this. You work this out in your own mind if you've ever seen someone mistreat someone and at some point they become like them. Okay, and that's what Elkins is talking about. And so Sambo, in some ways, becomes loyal because he accepts the new reality. Okay, that's deep, isn't it? Okay, and that's Elkins if you want to go read it.
That's similar to the Stockholm syndrome?
Let's talk about that later. Okay, and I'm sure it's deep, but I've got to get through these final slides. But others have come along, like Genovese in his Roll Jordan role, and there have been some other classic works that have said, no, look, Sambo is not the only personality. Not everyone was shell-shocked like Sambo. Not everyone conformed to the wishes and the will of his master like Sambo. There were many personalities, and one of them was the trickster, the other is the conjurer, another is Nat. The trickster, and And we learn about the trickster through the Brer Rabbit tales. Have you heard of those? It's this idea that among slaves that they were tricked into getting onto the boats initially, in some cases, not only with nets, but with other ways to lure them onto the boats from Africa. So that oral tradition had been passed through African kinship networks, that they were tricked initially to be brought from Africa to the United States, and that it was okay in that reality to trick through your wits the master. And so the trickster is a person that's mastered deceit. The conjurer is someone that's learned how to use powder, ashes, ground up bones, words that are spoken in African tongues that are not recognizable to plantation owners, and they try to cast a spell on people around them. They're feared because they have connections to superstitions that go back to Africa. The conjurer then is a person that uses superstition, and the slaves feared them. They were always predicting that the master would die, that kind of thing. And then Nat is Nat Turner. This is a person, his personality, he's looking for a fight, and he's willing to take it to that limit. And so plantation owners, overseers came to look for these personalities. More recent historians have expanded on the list. Elkins concentrates on Sambo, who's considered the essence of the loyal slave. Now, one of the archetypes is Mammy. As we head down our final slides here, Mammy is considered one of the last people that plantation owners thought would leave the plantation. When everyone was leaving and going to the city, or at least trying out another plantation, planters believed that Mammy would stay there. She would stay loyal. Now, the archetype for Mammy that was spread through the Old South during and after the war was she was heavy-set, older, dark-skinned, round-faced, not romantically inclined. She was a family confidant, warm, patient, soothing, and in deference to the family she cared for. How many of you have seen Gone with the Wind? That's what the stereotype had evolved into by 1938, but that stereotype, it had been in the South's national consciousness, regional consciousness, for 75 years before that movie came out. And if you go to see the Confederate Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, one of the depictions is a Confederate soldier turning his back on the other Confederate soldiers, which you'll have to trust me are to his right. And he turns as he's leaving to give his child to Mammy. Okay, so this is 1914. And so at least in the Southern imagination, they see Mammy as a loyal confidant. She's one that she has to stay loyal. Everybody's leaving, but Mammy has to remain loyal. But in reality, Mammy didn't live to an old age. On the average, she lived at 33 years of age. She lived a hard life. She had to spend considerably more time with the master's children than her own. That must have been heartbreaking, you know. Regardless of how well she was treated or whatever the affections for certain family members, she thought about leaving and hoped one day for the opportunity. In the readings that I've done, this is the common understanding. In reality, Mammy engaged in much domestic work, such as cooking, cleaning, and raising the owner's children. Domestic work is backbreaking. How many of you know that? Okay, right. But we're talking in a time before washing machines and dryers and all of the above. We're talking about scrubbing, a lot of manual labor. If you've raised kids, I know it's difficult enough for me raising, my wife and I raising one child. If you've had several children, and you're doing that and then trying to go back to the cabin at night and take care of your own child. In reality, contrary to the archetype, the first question for all slaves, including Mammy, when they were liberated and when the Emancipation was read, was should they physically separate from the masters? This would have been the worst thought that the planter could have. Surely Mammy wouldn't turn away from us. She raised our children. That would be what a planter would say. In reality, Mammy, many of the Mammies, did leave to the shock of the white families they had labored for. A Caucasian woman in Virginia from Litwack's book, Been in the Storm So Long, states, she writes, I cannot tell you how it oppressed me to miss the familiar black faces I have loved all my life and to feel that our Negroes cared so little for us and left at the first invitation. Remember I used the word delusion earlier? Right? Pro-slavery had put such a kind, gentler face on it. They had fooled themselves to live with the contradiction. Another Caucasian woman in Virginia from Litwack's work writes, as a general rule, they, that's the slaves, are all anxious to leave home, and many that seem perfectly contented in slavery are now dissatisfied, and many humane, kind masters who own large numbers of servants have been left without a single one. In reality, contrary to the archetype, this is who Mammy really is. One South Carolina Caucasian woman offered her Mammy double salary to stay and cook. There was a neighboring plantation that offered her more money to leave, but her original owner doubled her salary, said, I'll double the salary of what you would be paid at the other plantation if you'll stay. The Mammy had served the family many years. This is after the Emancipation Proclamation was read, when she was free. And this is a classic response. The Mammy replies, no, miss, I must go. If I stay here, I'll never know I am free. Okay, lost cause tenets of the late 1800s. You've heard about the lost cause, haven't you? It's a post-war explanation by Southerners among their elites, constructed by Pollard in his book called Lost Cause, by Jubal Early, by William Pendleton, by Jefferson Davis in his 2 volumes. It's a post-war explanation of what the South was really fighting for. That would be, think about in your life, your own perspectives on how things have happened and how you construct them in your mind. Okay, and this is how it was from my perspective. Well, Southerners, this is their belief system after the war, I suppose, to live with everything. The antebellum South represents honor, valor, and other virtues. That's what many Southerners told themselves as a post-war explanation for why the war was fought and why they lost. Generals such as Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson embodied those ideals. Longstreet's insubordination at Gettysburg proved fatal. That's an essential tenet of the lost cause. That's why the South lost. The South was overwhelmed by superior numbers and logistics. That's the steady drumbeat behind every Southern explanation for why they lost the war, is that it was impossible to win the longer the war went on. War was about states' rights rather than slavery. Okay? And slavery was a benevolent institution, and slaves were loyal and faithful to their benevolent masters. That's a critical tenet to our presentation here today, is that slavery was a benevolent institution and slaves were loyal and faithful to their benevolent masters. This is a chapter right out of pro-slavery propaganda. But by the 1890s and into the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, lost cause explanation was becoming the dominant thought process for Southerners to make them feel better about why they had fought and how they lost. So, part of that the South, that the institution of slavery is a benevolent institution, that it worked for the good of slaves. Essential to that is there was this loyal slave. Not just Mammy, you might call him Sambo, but he's a person that remained loyal to the South. At least Southerners, in their conscience, wanted to believe that he remained loyal. And so in the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, there's an African-American bondservant marching with the Confederate soldiers off to battle. Now that's 1914. Keep in mind, why is a bondservant, African-American bondservant, being included in the Confederate Memorial at Arlington in 1914? 1914 is when lost cause has reached its pinnacle. And what they're saying to those that have ears to hear and eyes to see, the monument is saying slavery was not all that bad. There were slaves that remained loyal, and they were best epitomized by being with Confederates on the front line. Edward Porter Alexander, how many of you know him? He was in charge of Longstreet's artillery in the bombardment before Pickett's charge and in the Peach Orchard at the end of the second day's fighting. This is a story that he writes to a northern audience in New York City through Century Magazine, now republished in Battles and Leaders. This was written somewhere between 1884 and 87. But to his northern audience, he writes, "The firing had hardly ceased." Now he's talking about the end of the second day's fighting, and Confederate guns have moved up forward into the Peach Orchard. And he's there with them. It's his guns. It's about 9 p.m. When my faithful body servant, Charlie, came up hunting for me with a fresh horse. Can you see a young black bondservant coming up with a fresh horse into the Peach Orchard? Maybe that wasn't in your picture of the fighting in the Peach Orchard. But Alexander's telling you, with a fresh horse, affectionate congratulations on my safety, and what was equally acceptable, something to eat. Negro servants, he writes, hunting for their masters, were a feature of the landscape that night. I have an account of a soldier from Pennsylvania at the angle looking across the Pickett's Charge fields the night of July 3rd, and he sees what looks like 100 fireflies out in the night, lightning bugs. And what they are lanterns of slaves body servants looking for their masters. There's if you look for it, it's there. Now, how do we interpret with proper analysis what he's saying early on about Charlie coming up and congratulating him in the Peach Orchard and giving him a fresh horse and food? What he's saying to his northern audience, for those that have ears to hear and eyes to see, he's saying to his northern audience, he's saying to his New York readers and to New York veterans, he's saying slavery was a benevolent institution. We were good to them and they loved us. That's what he's saying. He inserted that. It has nothing to do with the fight. He put that in for his northern audience because lost cause was starting to gain traction in the late 1880s. Can you see that? Okay. And I'm saying this as a side note. It's important. There were African Americans on every battlefield. This is a picture taken of burials going on at Chancellorsville. But there were African. Do you know Basil Biggs was here helping with reinterment of the dead here at Gettysburg to the National Cemetery? He was African American. I've done programs on just about every part of the battlefield over the years for anniversaries, battle walks, and all kinds of strange places. Some of you have survived it with me. And not looking for this, but I've picked up on patterns. I remember patterns, and they stick with me. I've found over and again where there are African Americans on the battlefield, digging trenches, burying the dead, setting up tents, washing clothes. Out on Barlow's Knoll, for instance, I have an account of Union soldiers. This is Theodore Gage. And I have to go back and look at my account on this. But I have an account of a soldier, Union soldier, and I have actually two accounts. First day's battlefield, Barlow's Knoll, where they're lying there wounded, they're wreathing in pain, and they see these dark forms walk across them. And they're African Americans using stretchers to pick up the wounded. You all have been out there with me when I've read these quotes. Or in the 9th New York Cavalry, just below Barlow's Knoll at the Josiah Benner Farm, there's an African American attached to the 9th New York Cavalry. He's a bond servant, not a body servant. There were slight differences, and there's some pay involved and stipends and so forth. And he was washing clothes when the fight started, washing clothes for the 9th New York Cavalry in the water. When the cannonade opened up, General Meade was in his headquarters at the Leicester Farm when one of the first incoming Confederate overshots at Cemetery Ridge crashed through. It actually disabled the porch of Leicester Farm, but another one came through the roof and mortally wounded his bondservant who was serving him dinner at that time on a platter, and the bondservant was an African American. It was a soldier in the 11th, an officer in the 11th New Jersey fighting at the Klingel Farm, second day of the battle along the Emmitsburg Road, and he had with him a bondservant. They were here. They were on the battlefield. They're mentioned episodically over and over again, and they're there for the burials because they would work cheaply. Does that have anything to do with justifying slavery if slavery is right or wrong? No, it means that they had learned to cope in some of the worst conditions and still give back. Okay, isn't that incredible? Okay. So body servants, the 44th Mississippi, this is the most famous picture of a body servant with a Confederate soldier. It was taken during the war. They were in the 44th Mississippi. They were not here at Gettysburg, but in the Battle of Chickamauga. The story that was perpetuated as the lost cause was gaining traction in the 1880s and 1890s was that the African-American bondservant saved the life of his master in battle. And then, and again, these older photographs have to do with Southerners telling Northerners, look, it was a benevolent institution. The lost cause was trying to emphasize that it was a way of them living with the contradiction, okay, of slavery. And then one of the more famous ones, Stonewall Jackson's cook was African American. He was featured in the movie that came out that was the sequel to Gods and Generals, the sequel to Gettysburg. Okay, last couple slides here then. Leaving. According to Litwack, no archetypal deserter emerged. The faithful and the troublesome left. The most and the least trusted left. Those who had endured a harsh bondage and those who counted themselves among the relatively well-treated left. You couldn't predict which quote-unquote archetype would leave. They all left. So that shows that even the most loyal were hiding their real feelings. Let me add this. I got to add this real quick. The biggest argument against Stanley Elkins, that the template was rearranged and that Sambo was shattered, we would say post-traumatic stress disorder, that he forgot everything from his past in Africa and that he was just a fumbling person on the plantation. The argument against Stanley Elkins on that is, ready for this? How much can you forget, no matter how bad the transatlantic slave trade was and the narrow passage was? It was a 6-week journey. How much can you really forget in 6 weeks? Think about the most traumatic period you've ever gone through in your life. Did you forget everything in 6 weeks from your past? Now that's why when we look at hip hop and jazz and we look at yams and we look at the Southern language, by the way, the Southern dialect likely came from African Americans. That's the current belief among dialectics. Linguistics, all of these things that survived, that African Americans have enriched our culture with. How do you think they survived? Because unlike Elkins' argument, they didn't forget everything. The template might have been temporarily rearranged, but they retained a lot of information, right? And so it might have gone underground, but African culture survived. Litwack points out this story of John Wise on a Norfolk plantation. John Wise, who was the son of the plantation owner, writes, Jim, the butler, my father regarded as his man Friday. Nobody doubted that one so faithful and so long trusted would prove true in this emergency. That's with Union soldiers overrunning the plantation, you see. But after helping to load the carriage with silverware and valuables, and just before they were to depart, Jim, that's the butler, disappeared. In vain we called and searched for him. We never saw him again. The prospect of freedom overcame a lifetime of love and loyalty. Ooh, I just got chills up and down back my neck, didn't you? Isn't that incredible? Now we know what he was thinking all those years when he quietly loaded people's bags onto carriage, quietly opened the door and welcomed people in and seated them. We know what he was thinking all those years. Robert Howell, a North Carolina planter, writes, he, Lovett, that's a slave of his, was about my age, and I had always treated him more as a companion than a slave. When I left, I put everything in his charge, told him that he was free, but to remain on the place and take care of things, because the whites had to flee the plantation. He, that is Lovett, promised me faithfully that he would, but he was the first one to leave, and I did not see him for several years. There's another story of, I didn't put this one in the slides, but I think she was in either Georgia or Tennessee. I don't remember which state, but it was one of the mistresses. And there was a critical moment where Union soldiers were getting closer and closer to their plantation, and the game was up. And she took all of the fine valuables, the jewelry and the silverware, and she wanted to hide it under the slave quarters, thinking the Union soldiers would look there after looking at the mansion, that maybe that would be the last place they look. She said, the mistress told one of the slave women, she said, if they come over here looking for this, you tell them you don't know anything about the valuables and that they're not here. And the slave woman looked at her. Imagine Union soldiers getting closer and closer and closer, and the clock ticking and ticking. She looked at the slave mistress and said, I can't do that. You bought those valuables with the money that you sold my 3 children with. See, we go back to symbolic truth, the slave block. It undermines all of the pretense of the pro-slavery argument and the lost cause easing of consciences. There's the other migrations that come. The first great migration to the north has to do with World War I. It's estimated 1.6 million African Americans move. This is when Harlem starts to take root during the first migration. That's when jazz really takes root. And then the second great migration is towards the end of the 1930s, Great Depression, 1940, 1970, estimated about 5 million African Americans left the South to go to the North or West, many going to California. And so we'll end with this conclusion. This is from Litwack. This is Kate. This is Kate Stone of a Louisiana plantation. This is where you make you run for the car if you want to leave. Okay. Even under, Kate writes, this white plantation mistress writes, even under the best owners, it was hard life. To toil 6 days out of 7, week after week, month after month, year after year, as long as life lasted, to be absolutely under the control of someone until the last breath was drawn, to win but the bare necessaries of life, no hope of more, no matter how hard the work, how long the toil, and to know that nothing could change your lot. Obedience, revolt, submission, prayers, all were in vain. Walking sometimes in the night as I grew older and thinking it all over, I would grow sick with the misery of it all. Thank you all for coming out for this particular lecture.